We've been synchronizing the different social medias tonight, and want to thank everybody for joining us. It's going to be a really special night, and some of y'all had no idea we had any technical trouble because you're listening to the podcast or watching it afterwards, but it's going to be absolutely great. This is our monthly Red Letter Christians book club, and I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag too much because we've got a really great special guest that we've incidentally been trying to get for a very long time, but yeah, she's awesome. And we're going to introduce her in just a second, but as people trickle in, especially with a little bit of the technical issues we had, I want to first say that as we're recording this anyway, we are in the middle of Advent, and this season that we wait expectantly and celebrate the coming of Christ and the continual work of Jesus in the world. We've had a really special series going on this whole month, where this year we've remembered God showed up for us in a certain way, and now we're invited to show up for God in the world in a certain way. So we began with Reverend Liz Theoharis, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, did a powerful video. God showed up for us as a homeless baby, and now we should show up for poor and low-income families in our world. And then we had Charles Keith, whose brother is wrongfully convicted and in prison, and he reminded us that God showed up for us as a condemned person, and now we should show up for folks that are incarcerated and on death row. Jack Sullivan, our brother out in Ohio, made a powerful video reminding us that God showed up for us as a victim of violence, and now we should show up for the victims of violence, and it's all of its different manifestations in our world today. So we got a few more coming, y'all. Alexia Salvatierre is going to do one on how Jesus was a refugee, and now we should show up for refugees. Lisa Sharon Harper is going to remind us that God showed up with brown skin, and so we're to show up for racial justice today. And we've got a bunch of copies of Lisa Sharon Harper's book. She's a board member and dear partner of here at Red Letter Christian. So we've got her newest book, Fortune, that we're going to raffle off randomly to a bunch of you who give this month. We've done a couple other things. We've had these hearts that we make out of a slice of a gun barrel that we gave away. And now we've got, this is really powerful. If you haven't seen these are tear gas ornaments from Bethlehem, where the sweet Lord Jesus was born in Palestine. Our friends have been gathering these tear gas canisters fired on them by the Israeli army and creating income and jobs as they make these ornaments to remind us, right, that the Prince of Peace was born in Bethlehem, an area that's still a really, really troubled region of our world. So we need some peacemakers in the world, and that's what we're talking about tonight. I'm going to introduce one of my favorite peacemakers. We got two of them up on here today, but Diana Oestreich is an incredible friend. She's a core part of our Red Letter Christians team. She's on staff. She's now taking on even more responsibilities, so she's helping rock this whole RLC operation. She's also a veteran now, passionate about peacemaking and training and lecturing on peacemaking. She wrote a great book called Waging Peace, and we've celebrated it during the book club. So she's going to kind of host and moderate the conversation. I get to sit back and listen and pump my fist in the air when Osheta brings a word. So she's going to also introduce Osheta Moore, our wonderful guest tonight. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Welcome. And Shane, thank you for kicking us off. I'm just so excited. This is like a book club unlike any other, because you'll often hear Shane give his Tennessee woo woo. I just feel like December is Advent. And if there is one month that we come together and we say the name of the Prince of Peace, and we say that the power has come to interrupt this violence that we've been experiencing in the world, in the hardest to reach places and also in our own backyards. So welcome for being here, and thank you for being part of this peacemaking community that really believes. We really believe that Jesus and justice is how love gets to be in every corner of where we live. So I am super excited to meet one of my peace heroes and one of my friends, Osheta Moore. And also, she lives in Minnesota, and I live in Minnesota, which means that we're basically neighbors. So, Osheta, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Diana. I'm so glad that we are neighbors and fellow Minnesotans, and I'm really happy to be here. It's gonna be great.
Well, I'm super excited because it is true that we have been really trying to get Osheta to come and talk with us at RLC, just because she is incredible, and I hope that you all are seeing her book places. It is called Dear White Peacemakers, because we need to support peace, and we need to support peacemakers like Osheta, who are writing and empowering us to do peace. So we're going to be talking about her book, but before we do, I'm going to tell you so a little snippet, just so a lot of people join our book clubs and they've never read the book, which is awesome. Yes. Because you get a sneak peek and then you read the book. So I'm going to give them a little snippet about the book. Dear White Peacemakers is a breakup letter to division, a love letter to God's beloved community, and an eviction notice to the violent powers that have sustained racism for centuries. Written in the wake of George Floyd's death, Dear White Peacemakers draws on the Sermon on the Mount, spirituals, and personal stories from author Osheta Moore's work as a pastor in St. Paul. So I'm going to read a little bit of Osheta's bio, because Osheta, I think it's so cool. I think there is just one in a million of you, and I just want everybody to get to have a little bit of your spunk and your fun. So Osheta Moore is a peacemaker based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Woo woo. She pastors Roots Church, is a prolific speaker, and the author of 2 books. One we are going to get to talk about tonight. She describes herself as, she says, I'm an African-American suburbanite Texan who fell in love with an urban core development in New Orleans when we moved into our under-resourced neighborhood. Since then, her and her family has evacuated New Orleans when Katrina hit, and her husband finished seminary and served at a church in LA. And now they are living and pastoring in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a stay-at-home mom whose 10-year plan had me comfortably settled in a law firm on the partner track, not settled at a messy kitchen table, keeping track of an urban minister's type budget. And until I married my white husband, I didn't listen to rap music, know the difference between Tupac and Snoop Dogg, or watch BET. So that's Osheta, everybody. Yeah. So before we dive in your book, like what do you most want people to know about where you're situated in the world that will give them context for your voice and why you needed to write this book?
Yeah, I think one of the things that most defines me, or that I look back and I see, like Lisa Sharon, or not Lisa Sharon, Britta Salter McNeil says, like, catalytic moments where inflection points where this really clearly shaped me, informed me, and influenced the kind of person I came to be, is that I found myself often the only in a lot of different spaces and communities, the only person of color, the only sort of more progressive or justice-minded person in a space where we didn't talk about that. Like, I found myself in a lot of these spaces, and instead of feeling ostracized or discouraged by that, I found myself really curious about the people who surrounded me, and having a deep desire to be in relationship with them and I see the good in people who are different than me. And so even though I've been in spaces where I have been clearly the most different person in that space, whether it's ideologically or the way that I look, I have always found that I find such joy and such sense of calling and leaning into curiosity. And in doing that, I have found that being a peacemaker for me means being the kind of person that holds on to the humanity of all people and says that if you have a perspective that I deeply disagree with, a perspective that I might even think challenges my dignity or violates my dignity, then I'm not going to pass on that shame or that hurt to you in my quest for us to kind of understand each other and in our quest to move forward. Because yeah, I've just found that has just been the story of my life. When I've been in these spaces, instead of leaning into that like impulse to violence or impulse to like ostracize or impulse to even self-righteousness, I found myself leaning into this impulse to have curiosity and dignity and the belovedness of others. And not to say like, I'm not saying that to be like self-righteous, but it's just, I've just never been comfortable with being the loudest person in the room saying the most challenging thing just for the sake of it. That's never been my thing. I've always been really comfortable with trying to influence people through love and relationships. So that's what I want people to know about me, is whenever I talk about peace or whenever I talk about peacemaking or whenever I'm in a space like this with new people, that what you're going to get from me, even if it's hard or difficult, you're going to get from me a lot of curiosity and empathy and love, because the kind of world that I want to live in is a world full of curious, empathic, loving people.
Which I feel like is, like drop the mic on that, because that is not the going thought leader that we hear from, and that is not the going influencer, and that is not the loudest voice in the room right now. And so I think one of the things that being a white peacemaker, it's tough for people to even know where to get in the ring.
Yeah.
And so I think that one of the most you write about like a really common experience, and I think it was right after George Floyd, but I think it's kind of this thing that you're saying where I feel like you put a stake in the sand about who you would be, no matter what people were wanting from Black women, or from you as a pastor, or from you as an anti-racism teacher. Like you wanted something different. And so I'm just going to read it and then ask you to kind of talk about it a little bit. So if you do have her book, it is chapter 7 called Where Does It Hurt? And then, so you were talking about a Black leader that has a prophetic gift to call out the ugliness of white supremacy in the starkest language she could find. And I respect her for that. However, I think there's a danger in conditioning white audiences to receive our correction with a side of humiliation. That's how I felt for those white people humiliated. Not a single thing in that video spoke to their humanity or the very real pain they might be experiencing as they leave behind these racist ideas and frameworks. So I went over to my account, and I think when you did this, and now I'm like, oh, you did this on purpose. So you went over to your account and you did a little experiment for 4 weeks. Once a week, I posted a heart check-in for White Peacemakers, asking some variation of a question I learned from a podcast interview with civil rights activist and teacher, Ruby Sales. Where does it hurt? Every week, the comments were filled with white peacemakers thanking me for the chance to share their heart and request prayer. All of them treated that space as a gift. No one took advantage. And I think there's a fear that if we as Black leaders give white people an inch, they will take a mile across our backs. And it is a well-founded fear. But sacrificial love for me, peacemaking for me, is a holistic work of hope. I choose to trust the good in you, and if you let me down, I'll lean into the goodness of God to sustain me. This is the only way I can practice anti-racism and live into my peacemaking values with integrity. And then it says that a friend told you that you were being a little bit too nice on your feed. And she just was like, man, I just can't follow. I can't follow you right now because you're just being a little bit too nice. And I need you to yell at me, is what your friend said. The question I wanted to ask her, but couldn't because we were meeting in a group was, why do you need me to yell at you? This is an expectation I've encountered in so many white peacemakers. A desire for my Black anger, a need for me to put them in their place. And this is a really cool thing that I'm going to end on. Do you know that when you ask me to do this, you're asking me to dehumanize myself? Do you know when you ask me this, you are taking away my agency to choose to love you in the ways God is asking me to? When you ask me to get angry, to be real, I need you to honestly ask yourself whether it is because you want to learn and be challenged or because you want an acceptable, angry Black woman in your pocket, your own little social justice warrior, Beyonce. So I feel like when you, like, that's just incredible. So I was just going to ask you to like share a little bit about what that really means for you.
Yeah. Thank you for reading that. I didn't know how effective hearing a white person read that would be, so I'm a little bit emotional. And the reason why it's affecting me is because I came into this work really first owning my identity as a Black woman and knowing that God didn't make a mistake in giving me my skin, and knowing that my social location is because of oppressive systems and not a neglectful God. And I came into this work breaking through and owning my humanity and saying, I am loved. And the funny thing, the curious thing about love is that once you experience that kind of love, that kind of wholeness, everything you're, at least for me, I'm super protective of anything that will come close to robbing me of that. Mm-hmm. And so when I entered into this work from that place of like, I'm loved, and I just know how great it feels to be healed by love. And I just want like you to be healed by love. And I see that racism in different ways as a white person has prevented you from owning your belovedness and feeling whole. White supremacy, racism has done that for me. And I just come into this work angry and using violence. Violence always begets violence. Violence never begets peace. And so, yeah, so when I wrote this book this particular way, so this what's out in the world is probably like the third iteration of this book, because when I first signed the contract for this book, my publisher and I were like, hey, we need sort of an Anabaptist-y peacemaking kind of spin on anti-racism. So can we just write a book that's like how to be an anti-racist with some of our peacemaking ethos kind of like intersecting with it. And I just found that the voice that I was using for that book wasn't real, and it didn't feel real for me. The voice that this book is written in is really a voice that was my truest, like across the kitchen table in a coffee shop. Like if you were to hear me talk about this stuff, it really came from like, I just want white allies to know that they are loved and that they are human, and that white supremacy has robbed them of their humanity. And I want them to know they are beloved. Like I want them to do this work with the goal of like wholeness and healing and restoration in mind, and not the goal of alleviating shame or fear. Like I don't want that. And so for me, when I wrote that chapter, I was thinking about a couple of instances where I was at different rallies or different spaces surrounded by white allies, and just thinking like, are they going to be okay? Like, are they going to be able to, like this, they're in the moment, they have something to do, but like when they're sitting at home reflecting on all that they've seen and all that they've gone through, like what do they have? What's going to sustain them? Like I just felt so concerned about them. And then I also am thinking about how so many books on anti-racism sold out or were at the top of book lists after George Floyd was murdered. And as I was watching white allies, white peacemakers process these books, what I was noticing is that they were processing them in spaces and then being corrected by people of color in ways that I felt was too harsh, or not giving them opportunities to ask questions, more like shutting down, like and then them accepting that. And that really bothered me. And so I wanted to write this book simply from that voice, because, you know, I really believe that there are some spaces for hard truths, and I really believe there are some spaces to tell, to put white people in their place. Like I think that there are spaces for that. But I think that the overall tenor and the way that the conversation was going at the time that I wrote this book was setting up this weird flip of a power dynamic, to where white people who were just now coming into this work were learning to come into this work also accepting a side of like shame or otherizing from leaders of color that I just couldn't get down with. And so that's why I wrote this book from that perspective. And for me, it's been really hard, because I have had some of those leaders sit me down and say, like, you are being too kind, or you are setting yourself up for a lot of harm down the road, or you know, you need to be really careful. And tell them what I often say is that, or what I said is that there's no other way I can do this work with integrity. Because if I were to do it with the, you know, you're don't center yourself, white people, it's not about your feelings. If I were to do this work from that perspective, it would chip away at some of that healing and wholeness that I worked so hard for. Because the reality is that the beloved community is a community where we own our belovedness, we proclaim and protect the belovedness of others, and that is what it means. And then we become this beautiful expression of belovedness that resounds. And so I can't treat another beloved as somebody who doesn't have a story that got them to that place where they might be complicit to racist ideas. I can't call a beloved racist. So like I talk about in my book, like I don't call white people racist. Even if they're doing something blatantly racist in front of me, I wouldn't call them a racist, because that word has so much historical baggage and shame and dehumanization attached to it. So when I talk about it, I say that as a person who is beloved, who is susceptible to white supremacist ideas. That's the narrative that I have in my head. And then I would ask them, or I would be curious, like, do you recognize the harm of maybe some of the things that you're saying, or some of the things that you're doing? Are you interested in having a conversation about that? Because sometimes they're not, and that's okay. But that doesn't give me permission to walk away and call that person a racist. So like this deeply humanizing ethos that I just have carried with me in so many other areas of peacemaking, like in urban core work and in my pastoral work, like I just carried that into anti-racism.
I just think that is it's brave. It's just super brave, Osheta. And you are just one of the bravest, kindest people. And you have things on the line. You have 3 biracial children and 2 sons.
Yeah.
So you're not coming to this with ideas. You're coming to this with real terrifying concerns for your children to stay alive. And then you're also holding the world that you deeply want to live in, which is one that it's of belovedness.
Yeah, I mean, I write a chapter in the book where I ask where I ask the white peacemakers to do me a favor if I don't make it home safely, and that whole chapter is about how I recognize that I am a person of color, I'm a Black woman, and I live in a world that is so deeply beholden to white supremacist ideas, and white supremacist ideas are always violent. So I'm in danger of violence, and you know, I recognize that having this posture of an openness and this like vulnerable, humanizing posture in this work, it makes me vulnerable. Makes me, and so in that chapter, I asked them, that to be the kind of white people, the kind of white peacemakers that show up for my biracial children in meaningful and powerful ways if anything ever happens to me. Because I believe that in the same way that I don't believe that violence begets peace, I believe that love begets love. And if I am loving and I happen to die in the course of being loving, I want white peacemakers to show up and being loving to my children, so they can actually see that there are white people who are good and who care and who show up and it matters to them to to address some of the anger and heartache and frustration that they're gonna have and that they have been carrying because of race. And so I talk about that because it is. I live this every single day. But what I don't get to do is I don't get to transmit that harm and that hurt to other people made in the image of God, just because they are white. I don't get to do that. I am the one that stopped that cycle of violence. So even though it comes to me, I'm not going to pass it to them. And so then I just ask, I'm going to do this work. So can you do the work of showing up lovingly for my kids and for my family?
Which is so powerful. And it's a legacy, Osheta, to like step in front of violence and say, I won't pass it on. That's why I'm so hopeful. And your book, for anybody who is intimidated, is not an intimidating book. I got the honor of endorsing it, and I felt and I wrote that it was like a North Star in the constellation of the world that we are aching for. So whenever I hear everyday people say, well, it doesn't, like, Diana, it doesn't matter. Like I feel like they're trying to actually tell me that the small acts that I do don't matter.
Yeah.
So, because we'll never fix it. And I was like, no, because when my sons see one person show up and do something in love for love in public, it is like insulating them. I feel like it fuels them. It's giving them this internal root system that says, I see good in the world. Even if the brain sees 1,000, like stories of the worst of the worst. And I feel like white peacemakers can do that. There's this one conversation that I feel like, would you do it in like super gutsy? Like I wouldn't even have this conversation at all. And you tell this story about this, I'm assuming, elderly gentleman named Trevor from a small Minnesota town. And for people who have heard the Black Lives Matter and then the Blue Lives Matter, and for a lot of us, we live in families where they've heard this conversation and they don't know what to do about it. And it's really, really intimidating. But you took on this challenge. So this is Osheta, folks, everybody. So some guy hears her on a podcast and takes issue with her saying Black Lives Matter. What does she do? Gives him her phone number, does a Zoom call with him just to hear his perspective. And I'm just like, I have never done that. I don't think I could do it. But you do it. And so I'm just going to give you a little snippet. Then you got to tell people this story you had with this guy.
Okay.
Yeah. So Trevor was raised in a rural Minnesota community where, as he told it, quote, the blacks and whites got along okay. They never played the race card and we never bothered them. But then he moved to the city for work and began to notice, quote, a different kind of black. They seem so agitated all the time. And it just seems to me that Black Lives Matter is just another thing for them to use to be all up in arms about. No one knows for a fact that race has anything to do with all these boys being pulled over by the police. So I just can't get behind that organization. So I think we've heard that loud, super loud, under the table, like leveled at Black Lives Matter. So you respond to him. You're on a Zoom call with him. I'm still just like, wow, like, that's gutsy to do that. And so you tell him, you're just like, and the fact that you always listen to other people first. You said that when you have these calls, you ask their perspective first. And so you say, yes, I've met some really nice police officers And I even know some police officers who I think believe they would never treat a Black person differently than a white person. I've had some really bad experiences too. Would you mind if I share with you a story? He agreed, and I told him about bringing my kids home from the youth retreat. And so anyways, you tell him about your experience, and then he listens, you think, and then you end up telling him, Trevor, do you think maybe police officers, because they're human beings, are subject to that same kind of impulse to try to make themselves feel safer, more powerful, and maybe it's even greater because they're doing it for the whole community? He said again. Well, maybe. But I think that how you had that conversation with him is something that white peacemakers probably really want to be able to hear, so that they could follow your lead, like having that conversation. Because as a mom of a Black son, like, Black Lives Matter is so significant in their city. And I feel like you also asked Trevor, is there any organization that is advocating to stop violence against Black people and requiring the violence to stop and asking for accountability and for it to stop? And he was like, no, I don't know of any other organization to get behind who's doing that. So I just think that's a conversation that is happening right now, but few know how to do it.
Well,
I say about that.
Yeah. So I would say, so one of the things that I think is really, really important, and that I try to do whenever I teach anti-racism, is to be able to be humble enough to check my own complicity to white supremacy and my own complicity to prejudice ideas and racist ideas. Like, how have I been formed by these lies? And so one of the things that I told Trevor was that, my husband and I worked in a neighborhood in New Orleans known for its gang violence. And we had a 2-year-old little boy at that time. And I would catch myself sometimes, pulling my son closer to me as if we were walking on the street, and some of the kids who I knew were gang affiliated were walking towards us. I would pull them a little bit closer to me. And I'm like, why would I do that? I'm brown, he's brown, they're brown. I'm in my early 20s, they're 14, 12, 13 years old. We're neighbors. I know their mom. Like, what is it about that made me pull my son a little bit closer? What is it about that makes me a little bit nervous when I'm alone with a Black man in an elevator or walking down the street again? So for me, it was important to help Trevor. I had to de-escalate, because for me, I could have come into that conversation quoting him and sharing all the facts and giving him history about how, there's a through line between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. And if you are okay with Dr. Martin Luther King and the work that he did, then you should be okay with what's going on right now. Like, I could have done all that. And I know that stuff. Like, I could come, but that's not what he needed. He was his energy level was like, he was really like ready and defensive. And so I had to de-escalate. And the most reliable de-escalation tool that I have ever used is storytelling and shared humanity. When I tell my story and I offer that, yeah, me too moment, like, immediately there's this sense of like, can we talk about this as equals? Can we, like, I see you, you see me. Like, I'm not here to judge you. And so I told him that because I wanted him to see that, like, even I as a person of color struggle with this. So there's something going on. It's not white people are bad, people of color have it all figured out. Like, there's something going on. So I wanted to do that. So that was the first thing. And then the next thing that I felt like was really important was for him to hear that story about how we got pulled over by a police officer, a white woman who yelled at me and yelled at my kid, and there was no reason to pull us over. And my kids had just had this amazing experience at a youth retreat And I was like, thank you, Jesus, because they're PKs, and PKs they interact with their faith in a very particular way. And I have so many thoughts and questions, and having them experience God that way at that retreat, I was like, yay. And then this thing happened with this police officer. So then I told that story of that experience and being like, something's going on. Why did she feel the need to pull us over? And I think doing that helps me to be able to say, do you see that there maybe is a through line where, like, because of white supremacy, we just don't see each other, and we don't trust each other, and we don't love each other, and we're afraid of each other. And so what happens when somebody who doesn't see and doesn't trust and is afraid is given a gun and given a badge and given authority, and they haven't dealt with their own stuff? Do you think that they might take that into their job? And then helping him see that, I was like, okay, so now do you see that why that person needs accountability? So for me, it wasn't I needed to school him, but I needed to invite him into the lived experience so that he can say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I think it was helpful. I haven't heard back from him, so.
Well, I think it was really helpful because I don't even feel like people can, I don't even feel like people feel like there's room to even ask somebody to listen to them, or even ask them to look at why Black Lives Matter might be significant in history, in our moment, in changing the trajectory of what we actually want in the future. Mm-hmm. It's either like they're out or everybody's in the same thought. And I think the way that you did that, it pivots things. It creates that third way, you know. So I was just really, really wowed by it. And I think the average person, and even somebody who's an expert on things, I don't think that they oftentimes will engage with people. And so I think that love is creating a legacy that is transforming who we are and where we want to go, because we don't change without connecting with each other. Like we are tied up in that garment of destiny together. Like, I think if that's one thing that peacemaking says is that we are connected, and I can't cut you off. I can't throw you off the island. I can't just kill you if you're a problem. Like, we're together. So what can we build together where everybody gets a seat at the table and everybody has what they need to thrive?
Yeah. 100%.
So what is, like, if you were to give people, like 3 things, most important things, or just 3 things you find in your work as a spiritual director, in your work as being a human who has decided your belovedness will be protected. Like, you won't take it from other people, and you won't step outside of things that take it from you. What do you want Jesus followers to follow in?
Okay, so the very first thing, and I say this all the time, and I will never stop saying this because I think it is so incredibly important. So the pandemic, George Floyd's murder in the middle of the pandemic, and the uptick of conversations around race and justice, I think it was so important. And I heard one person say that, like, people were not looking at anything else. We didn't have anything else going on. And so the fact that George Floyd's murder kind of just swept across the world is because it was all that we were looking at, because we didn't have our life going on. But one of the things that I noticed and that I started to get concerned about was that there are so many white peacemakers consuming good anti-racism books and education, and, like, really coming to terms with some of the things that have been going on in our country, but they were doing it on their own. And they were doing it isolated because of the pandemic for all the good reasons. This is not work that we can do on our own. What we are doing is we are healing historical generational brokenness. What we are doing is we are bridging communities back together So that means that we can't do this work on our own. I can't do this work by myself. I can read something and have an aha moment, but I have to go and have a community of peacemakers who are committed to anti-racism, with whom I process it, and that I bounce my ideas off, and that I share my heartbreak with, and that they hold it, and that we hold each other's humanity, and that we claim each other's belovedness, and then we go, like, the beloved community is the beloved community. It doesn't stop at Henry Nouwen's work of our own belovedness. Like, beloved community means we become a community of beloved. So what the very first thing I would say is, if you are a white person and you are doing this work, you're going to hear your story doesn't matter, your emotions don't matter. Like, you don't use your don't use your tears as weapons. Those are all really good warnings, but you do need to have a space where your story matters, where you can cry openly, where you can be held and your humanity can be acknowledged and you can be called beloved. So you need to have other white allies, white peacemakers that you are doing this work with, not just reading my book, but then meeting with each other and talking about the ways that you are showing up for anti-racism, the ways that you are being a peacemaker, and the mistakes that you make, and the things and the good things that you do. You know, celebrate that shalom, like, but do it in community, because this is work. This community healing work. This is not just individual healing work, right? That's the first thing I would say. The next thing I would say is, it's really important for you to recognize that this work is going to touch on all parts of our, like, when I talk about anti-racism peacemaking being a holistic way of doing anti-racism, it's recognizing that when you do this work, you're going to touch on some past trauma, you're going to touch on some present insecurities, you're going to touch on some, your pride's going to be checked. Like, it's going to be a deeply emotional work. So it would be really good for you to have, you know, a spiritual director or a therapist or a pastor or somebody who can companion you in that specific way. So not somebody who is going to be your cheerleader to do more work for anti-racism or justice, but somebody who will just hold those and process those, all that stuff that's coming up in you. I heard one person, Maisha T. Hill, say, you know, you need the holy trinity of caregiving. You need a pastor, you need a therapist, and you need a spiritual director. And she was saying this to white people. And I was like, yep, that's it. You need that. You need that wraparound care. Because the anti-racism peacemakers that I know who are doing this work sustainably, who are bumping up against the hard, but then coming back to it, are the ones who have that wraparound care. So when they know, like, oh, somebody checked me on a microaggression and I got defensive, it's not because I don't care about anti-racism, it's because I had this childhood trauma and that thing that they said triggered that. And so let me tend to that, because I think that's a lot of times as a person of color, what I'm seeing when I say, hey, that, you know, did you know that was a harmful thing? That defensiveness is not just the fragility because you're not used to talking about race, but it's also something else was triggered. So just, that's the second thing I would say, is have that care. And then the third thing I would say is, you know, find the voices that matter, that have been really meaningful to you, and then support them. Mm-hmm. Like, do your very best to let them know that their work matters to you, and ask how you can support them. Rachel Held Evans was a leader that I loved so much, and she passed a few years ago, and she and I built this like kind of sweet online friendship. But I remember one time I had written something about, I can't even remember, but I had talked about race in an article that was kind of, a lot of people were reading, and I was getting a lot of flack online for it. And she sent me the sweetest message of saying, like, I see you, like, you don't have to reply to me, but I just need you to know that I see what you're going through. I see how vulnerable and brave that was. Your voice matters. Don't give up. And that was actually at a kind of a pivotal time for me that I got that message, because I was like, am I doing this work because I'm Black and it just matters to me? Or am I doing this work because God has called me to it? And when I say I'm doing this work, I'm particularly saying the work that I feel called to be a spiritual director, to be a companion to white allies in this work. Like, I was kind of feeling myself lean into that, and God was forming me into that. And that was kind of the angle that I wrote that, or that I contributed to that piece. And when she brought that to me, I was like, yes. And so, you know, find the voices that most resonate with you. Like my friend who says, I need you to yell at me, she doesn't follow me. But there is somebody that she follows that she's like, she gets me, you know, like there's something about the way she talks about race that I totally get. And I actually like really appreciate her perspective and how she manages that and how she manages her social media. She follows her and she supports her. So those are the three things I would say. You can't do this alone. No one asked you to do this alone. This work, I think we're in a lot of danger if we try to do all this work alone. In danger of feeling overwhelmed and giving up, in danger of self-righteousness. Find community to so do this work in community. Get that wraparound care that you need because this work's going to trigger. And then for white allies, find the leaders of color who are ministering to you, who are speaking to you, that you're learning from. Tell them that you're learning from them, and find ways to support them.
That is so practical and just so human too, because I think encouragement is like a dying thing. I'm just like, I'll get a random message from somebody I don't even know on the internet saying, I see you. Good job. And I'm just like in tears over here. And I'm like,
yes.
I don't know if we like, our deepest need is to hear that, we're created in love and we're loved and we're seen. And like we can give that to each other along the way. Not as perfect people, but if we're going to keep showing up, then we're going to need to keep hearing that, that we can keep showing up. And sharing our stories, because I think if you do start to speak up, which is what I think white allies need to do, a lot of people lose a lot of friends and lose relationships and families because there is an allegiance factor. And when you start to say, I am unwilling to not speak up about violence when it hits Black and brown bodies, that is a deal breaker and losses, So I thank you for those 3 really practical ways, because that's what I want for my kids and your kids, that they will have just rootedness and surrounded with people who will love their humanity and be with them as they continue, like building the world that they're uniquely meant to be part of.
Exactly.
And one another really cool thing about your book is you have breath prayers.
At the
end. So would you mind, we're gonna end, folks, but before we do, we are going to have Osheta lead us in one of the breath prayers that she offers at the end of every chapter. There's one.
So I suggested the breath prayer, and then I was like, oh, there's several in this book because I end every chapter. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit. Can I just tell you a little bit like behind the scenes book? Okay. So I wrote this book the 3rd time around. I was like, okay, they're getting like sitting across from the coffee table. Like I think I literally even say, like, hi, come in, sit down, let me give you coffee. Like I think I even say something like that. Like this is the way that we're gonna talk, okay? And one of the things that I found myself doing as I was writing this book was asking myself, okay, like I just dropped like something really hard in this part. If I were sitting with somebody, like, what would I do? And I'm training to be a spiritual director, so I'm very, very comfortable with this silence. Like I'm just like, let's just take a moment and just ponder what we just heard, or let's check in with ourselves. Like I've grown very comfortable with that, and so I found myself as I was writing this book wanting to, again, anti-racism peacemaking, the way I define it is like doing this work of dismantling systems of oppression that have harmed brown and Black people, but doing it with empathy and love. It's a holistic work, right? So I kept trying to like throw in like spiritual practices like throughout the book of like silence and centering, and like I kept trying to throw these things, and my editor kept being like, we don't have room for this, we don't have room for this. And so I finally was like, okay, I think I could sneak in like a breath prayer at the end of each chapter, as a way of saying like we are doing this work in bodies that are exhausted. We are doing this work with minds that have gone through trauma, but we're also doing this work as spiritual beings, and we need to tend to our souls as we're doing this work. And so just slowing down and checking in and connecting our breath And with what we're feeling, with a name for God that's meaningful, and then a request for the moment, reminds me of how, like, the disciples, after Jesus was a victim of violence, he experienced the oppression of a brutal Roman Empire, and they were like, "What are we gonna do?" Like, they were like all up here. Jesus showed up and he breathed. He said, "Peace, be still," right? And then there's something about connecting our breath, calms us down, connects us with God, and gives us just a little bit of that breathing room we need to move forward, right? So I kind of threw those in, and I got past my editor. So, but from doing that, I realized that I wanted to do this work long term. But I couldn't be the kind of I'm not built to be the kind of anti-racism teacher you would think would come from somebody who wrote a book. I decided to be a spiritual director. And so I'm in my final months of training to be a director, to be certified. And I came into the program and told my facilitator or the supervisor that I'm doing this because I want a companion white ally. I want to be able to sit and hold that space for them to experience that peace, be still, as they are processing anti-racism and as they're continuing to do the work of dismantling systems of oppression. And so I really love Howard Thurman and his work, how he was a mystic of the movement. And so that's why I would love to end our time together with a spiritual practice of breath prayer to remind ourselves to tend to our souls. And if you want to kind of stay connected with me, I used to do this thing on social media. I might do it again in the new year, where we would do breath prayers every morning. I did that during the pandemic, and that's kind of where this practice of crafting breath prayers. And I'm mostly active on Instagram, so I'm sure that information will show up someplace. So I'm going to close with a breath prayer. Before I do that, Diana, do you have a favorite breath prayer from the book? I mean, you have it in front of you.
I don't have a favorite.
Okay.
But I feel
you
like
know what?
You could do any one you want, because I feel like you do breath prayers. Like, some people say hello. Osheta just does breath prayers.
I know. Hey, let's do this, because I know that you used to pop in when I would do breath prayers. Okay, so you know how we would craft a name for God that was meaningful for us, and then a request for us, and then a request for the moment. So a name for God that's meaningful and a request for the moment. Let's craft our breath prayer in real time together, live, and then on the podcast. So, what is a name for God that we can use that is meaningful for us, that kind of encapsulates the conversation we had or this season? What is landing for you, right, Diana?
I think just God as my hope, or God as the expansive love, like a constellation of love.
Okay. So how about expansive love? And then what's a request for the moment?
I want joy.
You want joy? Okay.
Saying it.
Okay. So let's do God of expansive love. We embrace your joy. And I love that, because we do this work of anti-racism, not just to be the greatest social justice warriors in the room. We do this work of anti-racism because we want to heal generational historical brokenness. We want to bring love where there has been hate. We want to be agents of healing where there has been violence. Like the God of expansive love, that love that we can all find our way in to receive, and all find our marching orders to take out in the world. So God of expansive love. And then we embrace your joy, because this work is hard, but it's like there's joy. It's like with Jesus, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. For the joy set before us, we do this work because the beloved community is a community of celebrating our belovedness, celebrating our humanity. So that we need joy. And also, like Willie James Jennings says, joy is resist all of death and all its signatures, right? It's subversive. So let's do that. God of expansive love, we embrace your joy. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple deep breaths together. Breathe in with me. And breathe out. And breathe in again. And breathe out. kind of breathe at your own pace while I give us a little bit of instruction. So we're going to say, God of expansive joy. We're going to breathe in, and then we're going to exhale. And the way I like to do this is I like to, as I'm breathing, just imagine all of the kind of feelings and concerns and worries that have come up in me, maybe in the past hour since we just had this conversation. What's all the things that have come? I just imagine them just kind of right in the middle of my face. And then as I say the name of God, it kind of just breaks through, kind of like Moses parting the sea. The name of God just breaks through all of that. And then as I breathe in, I breathe that in and allow that to settle into my heart and in my body. And then when I breathe out, the request for the moment gives me that little push that I need to go out into the world. So take a moment and imagine all the stuff that's come up in this conversation for you. And then say, God of expansive love, God of expansive love. Imagine it parting it. And then breathe in. And let that settle. And then on the exhale, we embrace your joy. Those are our marching orders. That is what we're invited into. Let's do it one more time. God of expansive love, breathe in. And on the exhale, we embrace your joy. Amen.
Osheta, thank you so much. This has been a total joy. So RLC community, thank you for joining us for the book club. And before you leave, we are just still inviting people all through the end of the year to invest in peace and invest with RLC as a peacemaking movement of Jesus and justice. And if you do, you will be registered to win one of those tear gas ornaments that, if you want to see Shane jingle it, there it is. And it's a tear gas canister that was shot by the Israeli army in Bethlehem. So I feel like that is a symbolic of an interruption of violence for peace. And then don't forget to join us for the first of the month morning prayer in January. So that is what is coming up. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of this community. And Osheta, again, just thank you for your light and thank you for your joy and for leading us. We are so grateful and blessed to know you. All right. Good night.